Chapter 13. Antonio shivered and considered the brilliance of his imprisonment. A single cell, travelling at speed along the highways of literally anywhere. He peered out of the small window at the traffic. He had to admit, it was a brilliant system of incarceration. Hidden in plain view, neither here nor there. Permanent transit. No fellow prisoners, no prison culture, no contact with anyone. No jurisdiction, no escape. Nothing. He wondered how many others were out there. How many mass cars roamed the roads with passengers like him? He certainly wasn't the only one. Who knew how often he'd driven past one of these moving prison cells? Just sat there in his mass car, drinking coffee and reading the news, while in the next car, some poor fucker was held captive. Did they have Perdita locked up like this? On another highway? In another mass car? For all he knew, she was in the one behind this atrocious hellhole. Were Desdemona's security interrogating her with needles in the floor? Did they know she was pregnant? Maybe they did even worse things if he were pregnant. Maybe they'd sent her off to the remilitarized zone. The ebb and flow of the days had become a mystery. Antonio had lost consciousness again and again. All he ever saw from the window was a long tunnel under artificial lights. No idea how long he'd been here. He thought about the mission, the offshore negatives. The corporations had almost certainly retrieved them. Desdemona had just been playing with them. They'd known all along. It surprised Antonio how little he cared. He sat with his face pressed up against the small window, mesmerised by the traffic outside. The next car was only a few feet away, an arm's length. But its smooth chassis had no window and was nicely soundproofed. He'd yelled himself hoarse and punched the window and wall until his knuckles were red raw. No one could hear. And what would they do if they saw him? Some maniac in the next car. How would they understand? How would they help? The neighbouring car drifted by, as did the next, and the next. They reached a junction, and, in an instant, his lane peeled off and descended into a side tunnel where the walls and ceiling were a smudged concrete grey. The air misty with fumes. They gathered in another lane that fed into their tunnel, and as the roads merged, Antonio caught the briefest flash, almost like a hoop of lightning darting around the walls and ceiling they were speeding through. At such a speed, it left nothing more than a brief blue streak across his retina. He sat and watched the next car overtake. It was green. And the next, which was grey. And the next, which was moving erratically. Antonio sat up, alert. The car was jerking around, struggling to keep its line. He gasped as it bumped into the mass car in front of them, rebounded back into the one behind, and scraped the wall of the tunnel, sending up a shower of orange sparks before careering into his car. The impact was slight, but he had to steady himself against the wall and ceiling to keep from toppling over. Mass car malfunctions happened from time to time, but the surrounding traffic usually reacted better than this. The lanes should all be clear while the faulty unit made a rapid exit from the highway. But something was deeply wrong here. The traffic wasn't responding at all. The out-of-control vehicle was penned in, not least by Antonio's own transient prison cell. Senses alert. He heard the faintest thudding. Then the door of his wayward neighbour cracked open, and thick white smoke plumed out in a gust. Another thud, and the door was flung wide open. It smashed into Antonio's window before twisting off its hinges and dropping into their wake. The window now had a deep crack, and he felt the cold air whistle through, along with the acrid smell of burning plastic. The fumes pouring from the door thinned in the slipstream, and the passenger appeared, panicked and gripped by instinct. He was a young man, dressed in a suit, dark hair and olive skin. A thin moustache lined his gaping mouth, his red tie flapping in the wind. The cabin of his mass car was on fire, and through the haze of smoke, Antonio saw the orange flicker of flame. With the door now open, fresh oxygen licked the flames higher up the walls and across the ceiling. The man screamed as the heat pressed upon him. He clung to the outer rim of the open door, his attention split between the fire and the rush of the road beneath him. Just a few feet away, mouth against the cracked window pane, Antonio called to him, yelling for his attention, and their eyes met. Every part of the man screamed for help, his entire being focused on escape. Antonio felt powerless, only capable of witnessing the poor man's cries as they twisted and rose. He was starting to burn. Antonio urged him to jump, to leap onto his car. It was only a few feet, and if he could hold on, then the traffic was bound to stop soon. Mad with pain and fright, the man understood. He took a breath, his eyes glaring at the spot he was aiming for, and leapt. Slamming awkwardly onto the roof, he slipped halfway down the side of Antonio's car, his flaming leg kicking and sliding against the small window, searching for a foothold. Despite the slipstream, he kept hold of something on the roof, and his foot found the ledge. Then the man's own defective car jerked around and, without warning, skidded and slammed back into the side of Antonio's mass car. Caught in a cruel clap of solid metal, the man dropped and disappeared into the stream of wheels and machines flowing continually behind them. Antonio craned his head back, but he couldn't see far. And as the dead man's berserk car continued its bucking and swerving, he held himself steady, bracing for the occasional collision. With the whine of its unhappy engine, the runaway machine sped forwards and crashed between the two mass cars in front, forcing them aside as it shunted ahead, making its own path, squeezing onwards in a shriek of metal. Antonio could no longer see the burning car, so he listened through his cracked window. The white noise of traffic hissing over the road and the discordant whir of a defective motor somewhere ahead. The irregular clang of cars hitting one another. He sat down, eyes still glued to the window. Adrenaline. Action. He inhaled deeply and brought his attention to his breath, slowing it and concentrating on its passage through him. If he wasn't calm, he couldn't think. He needed to think, to gather himself. He exhaled and noticed the shiver in his fingers, the thud of his heart shaking his chest. He was trained, an experienced field operative. He knew action. He'd been here before. With considerable willpower, Antonio closed his eyes and inhaled again, his pulse still fast but slowing. With his growing awareness came clarity, simplicity of mind, the calm voice of reason. And his mass car collided with something solid. The front end lifted up and spun over. He was airborne for an instant, and gravity shifted. Then everything collided, and the world knew no boundaries. Sound, metal, velocity, pain and impact all merged. And Antonio found himself at the centre of a tight ball of destruction.